Hello. It's a great pleasure to give this presidential address to the South African Archaeological Society. And I'd like to thank everyone who came to its initial presentation in Cape Town back in April. Particularly, I'd like to thank Jeanette Deacon and John Parkington, both of whom were there, for all of the support they've given me in the course of my 40 years of involvement in Southern African archaeology. And I'd also like to take this opportunity of thanking every single member of the South African Archaeological Society for everything that you do to encourage and support and sustain archaeological work across the region. As you can see, I'm going to talk about the relationships between dogs and people in pre-colonial Southern Africa. And the reason for doing this is that dogs were the first domesticated animal. And a few recalcitrant cat lovers apart, they're widely considered as humanity's best friend. We value them as companions, as hunting aids, as herders and movers of livestock, as a way of transporting people and goods, as a source of textiles, food and clothing, as keen sentinels, as supernaturally powerful beings, even as a cure for sickness. Precisely because they have such a varied set of cultural connotations and because of the antiquity and near ubiquity of their association with people, dogs give us a unique opportunity to explore human-animal relations across time and space. But most discussions of this still emphasize the global north. Building on the work of colleagues like the late Liz Vught and Ina Plug, Tim Maggs and Judy Seeley, I've tried to compensate for this in papers looking at the canine connections of Southern African hunter-gatherers and herders. I'll rehearse a little bit of that material now, but also expand on it to include farming communities to give a fuller sense of the connections linking people and dogs in Southern Africa. At the same time, I'll sketch out some of the avenues along which a more systematic, archaeologically focused study of Southern African dogs might proceed. First, though, where do dogs come from and how did they get to Southern Africa? Difficult as it may sometimes be to believe, dogs are wolves. Not that this has always been scientific orthodoxy. Charles Darwin, for instance, as well as the renowned 20th century pioneer of animal behaviour studies, Carl Lawrence, both thought that the golden jackals of Eurasia might have provided another set of distant grandparents for today's dogs. But multiple genetic analyses of contemporary dogs and the ancient DNA of specimens from the archaeological record comprehensively show that this is wrong. Dogs are, without doubt, most closely related to the grey wolves of the Arctic, boreal and temperate regions of Europe, Asia and North America, the areas shown in green and red on this map. But they probably descend from one or more now extinct populations of grey wolves, not from any that are around today. And those populations lived exclusively in the Old World. All the dogs that were present in the Americas when Europeans arrived in the 1400s had Eurasian, not North American, wolf ancestors. When and where were the wolves that became dogs domesticated? The literature on this is vast and ever-growing, but we can summarize a very complex picture in a few words, remembering that domestication is a process, not an event, and that especially in its earliest stages, differences between dogs and wolves will have been subtle, indeed non-existent. That said, occasional animals that can be confidently identified as dogs occur soon after the maximum of the last ice age in Europe, within the area circled in that map. And they occur more widely thereafter in Europe and in Siberia and the Near East, and by at least 13,000 years ago had also reached the west coast of North America. Whether so-called paleo dogs from the few much older contexts marked by stars on that map, here in Europe and here in Siberia, were ancestral to later domesticated dogs, wolves that were living with people, or simply another wolf population altogether, continues to be debated, but need not concern us here. More importantly, if we look at these maps, we can see that there's a fundamental divide between areas within and south of the tropics and those to their north. Here, dogs spread quite rapidly across much of the northern hemisphere. But in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, in South and Southeast Asia, and therefore beyond that in Australia and the wider Pacific, dogs occur first much later, much more recently, no more than about 5,000 years ago at most. And in a series of papers, I've argued that one reason for this global pattern may be the challenges that a northern hemisphere species faced when encountering diseases native to the tropics to which it had little or no resistance, especially where those diseases may have been hosted by native canid species for whom they posed little or no risk. And if we think for a moment about sub-Saharan Africa, we have a series of such animals here. Ethiopian wolves, side-striped and black-backed jackals, foxes of various kinds, and of course, painted dogs. And Africa, in fact, provides perhaps the most compelling evidence for this hypothesis. Just like horses and cattle, for instance, dogs are seriously threatened by trypanosomiasis, the disease that in humans manifests itself as sleeping sickness. As you know, it's spread by various kinds of tsetse fly. And in dogs, it produces an infection that has mortality rates of up to 100%, at least in breeds of European origin. And that is why these Alsatians working for the Zambian National Park authorities spend their daytimes indoors, protected from tsetse fly, before going out on patrol at night. But sleeping sickness is not the only challenge that sub-Saharan Africa may have posed. Dogs are, for example, also highly susceptible to African horse sickness, as well as to diseases like canine babesiosis, which are spread by ticks. And common to all of these diseases is a pattern in which native African wild canids, like jackals and painted dogs, show virtually no symptoms if they become infected, in which breeds introduced from Europe suffer very high sickness and mortality, but in which indigenous African dogs display at least some resistance. But for that resistance to evolve, many generations must have been needed, leading us to predict a delayed expansion of dogs into the tropics compared to areas further north, where grey wolves would have occurred naturally, plus a more staggered spread of dogs through sub-Saharan Africa and indeed other tropical regions that was likely affected by shifts in the geographical range of pathogens and the vectors that spread them. So in the African case, for example, as rainfall belts contracted south towards the equator around about 2,500 BC, tsetse flies and therefore trypanosomiasis will have moved south with them, something that Andrew Smith has talked about at some length. At least partly for these reasons, dogs arrived in our region very late by global standards. Indeed, the oldest securely dated specimens come for now from early farming sites in the Tugela Valley of KwaZulu-Natal, excavated by Tim Maggs in the case of Ndodonwana Magogo, by Len van Skalkwijk at Woza and Mamba, and by Gavin Whitelaw at Kwaganda-Ganda. The time frame in question, no earlier than the 8th century AD. Dates from sites in the Limpopo Valley and in Botswana are even later than this, by several hundred years, as unpublished work by the late Ed Wilmson clearly shows. The smaller amount of skeletal material from hunter-gatherer and pastoralist context in the Cape and in Namibia tells the same sort of story. No sign of dogs before the tail end of the first millennium AD at best. I'll come back to how we identify dogs in the archaeological record towards the end of my talk. But for now, I want to switch direction and look at some of the ways that dogs lived with people and people made sense of dogs across southern Africa as a whole. As Angela Perry has perceptively stated, dogs were the first biotechnology. In other words, an example of people using animals not as sources of food or raw materials, but for their behavioral potential, for what they could do for people. An obvious example here concerns the contribution that dogs can make to human subsistence. Until just a few decades ago, for example, some peoples in the Kalahari used dogs to hunt a wide variety of animals, from the hare and steenbok and duiker, examples of which you can see at the top left, to much bigger animals like gemsbok and warthog, also here on this side, that were chased and pinned down so that human hunters could kill them. Fur-bearing animals like wildcats and jackals were also targeted. Indeed, so important were dogs that when Richard Lee was working in 1964 with the Jujuan community at Dobi in northwestern Botswana, those people were obtaining about 1/3 of their meat with the help of dogs, with about 80% of the men either hunting with dogs or owning them. Multiple studies in Botswana concur with this for other Bushman groups, while the 19th century Bleak-Lloyd archive for the Northern Cape adds that people there used dogs to hunt baboons and small carnivores, and in Lesotho, rock art, such as the panel seen here, suggests that they may also help people hunt eland, presumably by helping to tire them out. The behavior of other animals, like reedbuck, which also tend to lack endurance, suggests that in fact we might even add some more species here. But while it would certainly exclude animals like springbok that flee swiftly, dogs were clearly valuable as hunting aids, something emphasized by this famous passage in the Bleak-Lloyd archive, where Hankaso recalls how his grandfather had bought dogs from another man, used them to kill jackals, and then made skin cloaks that he gave back as an equivalent for the dog. A classic example of what anthropologists would call reciprocal gift exchange. While we lack detailed information for Kwe-speaking herders seen here on the left of this slide, dogs were, and in some cases remain, a significant aid for black African hunters when pursuing smaller sized animals from cane rats through to duiker, steenbok, oribi, and at least one 19th century case, also wildebeest. Since hunting was a valued competitive male sport as much as a subsistence activity, dogs were and are highly skilled in tracking animals down, holding them at bay or killing them outright, able in some cases to be called back to allow female antelope to escape, given medicines to enhance their aggression or their speed, and sometimes rewarded by being allowed to sleep next to their owner. A second way in which dogs can enhance human subsistence strategies is by helping us to herd and protect livestock. In many rural areas today, wild carnivores, especially jackals, still pose a threat to people's sheep and goats, with losses averaging 3 to 4% a year, but often more. Although penning up livestock at night is probably the best form of defense, dogs can undoubtedly help. And in the form of Anatolian sheepdogs that you see here on the right, they're deployed, as you may know, today in parts of Namibia to guard sheep and goats from cheetah and thereby help conserve threatened cheetah populations. But while 18th century European accounts praise Kwe dogs for their effectiveness against jackals, They also note that when facing lions or even hyenas, the dog sensibly chose to raise the alarm and then stay put rather than undertake an active defense. Meanwhile, the tracks of 3 dogs, along with those of people, cattle and sheep in these sediments near Walvis Bay in Namibia, neatly confirm how dogs could be used to round up and direct the movements of animals. In this particular context, probably linked to the well-documented trade in cattle in the late 18th, early 19th century to European whalers visiting the Namibian coast. We have, of course, no reason to think that people valued dogs only because they helped them find food or protect what people wanted to eat. Some European commentators suggest that Queque dogs were scrawny and not well cared for, but others emphasize the contrary. Jan Engelbrecht, writing of the Korana, for example, noted that they kept old goats and cows specifically to provide their dogs with meat and milk, and that they would also allow their dogs a share of the meat of any animals that they helped kill. On the other hand, Richard Lee notes of mid-20th century Kalahari-san that many dogs likely had to find their own food. Tough for them, but with clear benefits for people, especially in settled communities where dogs could supplement their diet by consuming bone, carcass residues, and human feces, as well as targeting rodents, something that Tim Magg suggested when publishing his excavations at Ndondondwan in KwaZulu-Natal. Differences such as these highlight the multiple ways in which people think about and understand and relate to the dogs that form part of the communities in which they lived. People's attitudes vary enormously, and that is precisely what makes dogs so interesting. One indicator of this is whether people bury dogs, either alone or with themselves. The picture on the far left of this slide shows what is in fact currently probably the oldest known dog from the continental United States, one of 2 buried at this site in Illinois close on 10,000 years ago. This is a common practice archaeologically among sedentary hunter-gatherers in Europe and North America. Southern African examples are relatively rare. We have a 5-month-old puppy that was buried with a young man in a shell midden at Cape St. Francis on the south coast in the late 1st millennium, plus 2 dogs buried beneath a stone cairn at Zeresine Mountain in Namibia around 300 years ago. But both hint that at least some dogs were shown a degree of care after death. Further detail emerges from the Bleak Lloyd archive, where Mark McGranahan highlights how Bushmen treated dogs like children. They were thought to be partly responsible for their own actions, but to be uninstructed in adult ways, and therefore in need of adult care and supervision, so that, for example, they would not disturb or scavenge the bones of hunted springbok, a form of disrespect that might mean that in future hunters would not successfully be able to go out and catch more. Hendrik Vickar, writing in the late 1700s, similarly noted how some Quequen had to completely dispose of ritually killed sheep so that neither dogs nor children could get at their remains. We're all, I think, very much aware that a dog's sense of smell and its sense of hearing are massively more sensitive than ours. As well as accounting for the many guard dogs kept by 16th century Mutapa kings in Zimbabwe, this can also perhaps explain instances where dogs are thought to have supernatural powers. The Damara of Namibia, for example, hold complex beliefs about how scent and wind can transmit illness. Chris Lowe, who's worked with them, records how this is extended to dogs who are thought, for example, to be capable of ending a human pregnancy by staring at somebody, but also how a small amount of dog's blood can, if drunk, cure children of illness. For the armed bushmen of the Northern Cape, on the other hand, dogs' sensory skills meant that not only could they detect real lions moving around the periphery of people's camps, but also malevolent shamans who often were thought to take on the form of lions. Even so, dogs are relatively unimportant in Am or other Bushman mythologies, and they feature only rarely in rock art. On the other hand, since few if any paintings can support a literal interpretation alone, perhaps we should think that when dogs do appear, they were not part of a set of meanings. We should think that when they do appear, dogs were indeed part of a set of meanings with broader supernatural significance. That was certainly the case in the very different context of dogs being specially reared, fattened, killed, and eaten as part of ceremonies intended to procure rain or make lightning among some 19th century Shona-speaking populations in Zimbabwe. But with this exception, most people in southern Africa have historically thought of eating dogs as something that is utterly repugnant or unthinkable, something that is in fact disgusting. And this is an almost universal pattern among speakers of Eastern Bantu languages. In contrast, one should note, to many Western Bantu speakers living in Angola or areas north of the Zambezi. Living with people, but not generally thought of as persons, dogs occupy a liminal space, one that allows us to project onto them many of our own ideas and concepts. This is evident in the multiple connotations that calling somebody a dog can have. So on the one hand, for Basotho, this could reference somebody's courage, their ability and capacity to excel. But it's often more negative, recalling how dogs may eat indiscriminately or have sex indiscriminately, ideas that are also shared by many San groups. Alternatively, calling somebody or referring to somebody as a dog may reference their subordinate status, an idea held by Zulu, Xhosa, Tswana speakers with reference to a king or chief subjects. Or it may indicate that those people don't know how to behave properly as adults, thinking here of Xhosa references to men who have not yet successfully completed initiation. Another excellent example of this kind of thing concerns the names that people give their dogs. Numerous studies, starting with that of Adrian Koopman in the 1980s, show how many dogs' names provide Zulu, Tsonga, and Shona speakers, among others, with a socially acceptable way of expressing grievance or commenting on problems with relatives and neighbours. This is subtle, it's elusive, but it's nevertheless readily and widely understood. Who, after all, could object if you call your dog to you? Particularly perhaps if it's out of sight and you're not sure where it is. You call it by its name. But when you've chosen to call your dog witchcraft intoxicated in direct reference to your neighbour, who has then called her dog as if you don't have witchcraft too, things take on a different flavour. And in similar vein, let us not forget here that for North Sotho and Tsonga speaking groups, witches can take on the form of dogs or change dogs into Tokolosh spirits. So far, I've drawn mostly then on the evidence of anthropology and history. What, though, might a Southern African archaeology of dogs look like? To start with, of course, we have to locate dogs in the archaeological record. But this is not as easy as it sounds, especially where people didn't bury them or where many animals may have died outside archaeological sites or outside archaeological excavations. So I want to highlight two issues. First, even the best archaeozoologist will not be able to identify all dog remains with complete certainty. Teeth and mandibles may be diagnostic, so too may the density, the morphology, the measurements of other bones. But especially when they're fragmentary, dog remains could be confused with those of jackals, painted dogs, even foxes, be classifiable only as canids or as carnivore perhaps. One way forward here would be to analyse them for their DNA, but this has not yet been successfully done in Southern Africa. Another would involve fingerprinting the collagen sequences in bone to distinguish between different species, a technique known as zooms. Again, this is still to be applied locally with dogs in mind. More indirectly, carnivore damage on bones may be informative. So, on the west coast of South Africa, the many weeks that John Parkington's Dunefield Midden site, shown here under excavation, was occupied, suggests that it must have been dogs, not jackals, that were responsible for most of the chewing and gnawing of seal bones that was taking place there. Similarly, at Andy Smith's site of Casteelberg B, chewed fur seal bones were probably chewed by dogs, not by jackals. And it's worth noting here that new microscopic approaches to analysing tooth marks that can certainly distinguish dogs from wolves might be a useful way of checking on this, and similar interpretations elsewhere. Having found dogs, what can we learn about them? I think that it's useful here to think about the idea of a canine biography, to trace, in other words, the life histories of individual dogs, both at the level of an individual, but then building up, scaling up to multiple individuals within sites and across time and space. Now, this is something that is going to require systematic, interdisciplinary research involving several different approaches. And it's not, I think, something that has yet been attempted in sub-Saharan Africa, although, as you'll see, there are some well-known instances of this in Europe and North America. Some of the relevant methodologies include those that I've listed here. Assessing skeletal remains to identify the age and sex of the dog. Is there any evidence of disease? Is there evidence of other kinds of pathology or injury that might, for example, reflect human ill treatment? Is there any evidence of veterinary care being applied? We could analyse the carbon and nitrogen isotope composition of the dog's bones and teeth, and also look at its dental microwear to get a sense of what kinds of foods it was eating. We can look at the strontium isotope composition of its skeleton to see whether, for example, it had lived all its life in the area where it has been found, or might it perhaps have moved from one area to another during its life? And if so, might this suggest the exchange of dogs between one human group and another? We can intensify research into trying to recover and analyze ancient DNA to explore genetic relationships across space and time. We can look for evidence of modification of the skeleton or of skeletal parts. For example, could we identify evidence of butchery that might suggest that the dog had been eaten, or that its fur had been removed, perhaps for conversion into clothing? Do we see evidence of other body parts, like teeth, for example, being used as part of ornaments or tools? And finally, when excavating, archaeologists might also keep their eyes open for dog coprolites that might themselves be analysed macroscopically for traces of ancient foods, but also via DNA and zooms to ascertain the diet of the animal and perhaps seek evidence of traces of parasitic infections, things that could also be done by looking at bone and also at dental calculus. So some of these questions have already received attention. Decades ago, for instance, Les Fucht identified more lightly built and more robust body forms among dog remains from Iron Age sites along the Limpopo like K2 and Schroeder and others in KwaZulu-Natal, although I would agree with Tim Maggs and Judy Seeley that pre-colonial dogs likely belong to a single, if diverse, gene pool, not well-defined separate breeds. Liz also wondered if burnt and cut-marked bones at Ndodonwan might indicate that dogs were sometimes eaten in an early Iron Age context, although a more recent study of those remains suggests that the evidence is in fact only minimally present. But while Ndodonwan remains an isolated first millennium case, it might, I think, perhaps be worth remembering here that its inhabitants made pottery assignable to the Kalundu tradition, the tradition to which the ceramics of historic Shona speakers also belong. Given other parallels between the two, might we perhaps therefore want to think here not of day-to-day dog eating, which is, as I've noted, virtually absent among speakers of Eastern Bantu languages, but of dog sacrifice and ritual consumption of the kind that I talked about earlier with reference to rain control and lightning control. Two examples from beyond Southern Africa show how rich a picture multidisciplinary studies of the kind that I'm advocating can deliver. Consider first this example, one of several dogs from a village from about 1300 AD on Vancouver Island in Western Canada. The dog in question lived about the same time that dogs were busy chewing seal bones at Dunefield Midden on South Africa's west coast, or hunting game for people at Mapungubwe on the Limpopo. We're talking here of an adult male dog that weighed about 16 kilos. It had a healed fractured rib that might, although not necessarily, have been the result of somebody kicking it in the side. It also had probable signs of osteoarthritis, although it wasn't possible to identify any particular cause of death. The dog was limping on its right back leg, perhaps from the same injury that is evident to its side. But it had clearly survived, probably with some degree of care, for some months after this injury had been experienced. And the fact that it was deliberately buried suggests that people recognized it as some kind of person. In fact, ethnographic evidence for the New-Char-North and other Northwest Coast peoples in Canada suggests that that fact of burial implies that it probably had a name and that it was recognized as having kinship-like relations with the people among whom it lived. The carbon isotopes of its body suggest that it had mostly been eating marine fish like herring, salmon, and anchovies, foods that may, in fact, have helped mitigate the effects of its arthritis, but foods that excluded the terrestrial animals that people in this village were also eating. Taking matters of diet further, as Judy Seeley and colleagues have done with several human burials here in South Africa, Rob Losey's team has analysed the carbon and nitrogen isotopic composition of a dog from Salakard in the far north of Russia. What they've done here is to compare the values for its teeth, which measure its diet in early life, to those from its bones, which cover what the dog was eating when it was older, with those from its nails and its hair, which reflect what it was eating in the final months of its life. And right the way through, they document that this female dog was eating a fairly monotonous diet of freshwater fish, ever since it had been weaned when it was about 2 months old. Along with the fact that this dog was recovering from a lower back injury at the time of her death, this again underlines the animal's dependence on people. Now, permafrost is of course absent in southern Africa, except perhaps on the highest mountains of Lesotho, so we can't necessarily expect Salakard levels of preservation. And as I've said, burials of all kind are unfortunately disappointingly rare in southern Africa. But these two canine biographies hint, I hope, at what systematic investigation of all possible scraps of evidence can give us. Taking things one step further, let me conclude by posing three broader questions that an archaeology of southern Africa's dogs might pursue, in parallel with the slowly growing number of social histories of more recent canine times by scholars like Sandra Swart and Innocent Dande. First, did the introduction of dogs to southern Africa have any significant ecological impact? Did it, for example, introduce dogs to indigenous carnivores? The flip side of the coin, if you like, from my earlier point about disease being a constraint on dogs' southward movement through Africa. Did the introduction of dogs intensify predation pressures on the species that they help people hunt. Did that, in turn, have any ecological consequences that we can detect? Second, what was the canine dimension of southern Africa's colonization and settlement by Europeans? The imposition of dog taxes in Namibia and bans on people hunting with dogs in the Eastern Cape, complete with poisoning and shooting of the animals concerned, are well documented. But how far, for example, did the introduction of dogs from Europe alter the gene pool of dogs in southern Africa? Nowhere near as much as in the Americas, for sure, since their almost complete replacement appears to be the phenomenon that we see. But this is a topic yet to be researched genetically as far as southern Africa is concerned. To look at things in another way, discussing what they called the art of the apocalypse, a late 19th century genre of rock paintings in the northeastern corner of the Eastern Cape and around the fringes of the Maluti Drakensberg Mountains into the Free State, Sven Oatsman and Jannie Loopse drew attention some years ago to strange dog-like creatures chasing and attacking grotesque human figures, a potential recasting of European settlers into the giant cannibals that had, according to the Maluti Bushman king, when speaking to Joseph Orpin in 1873, been defeated in mythical times by the hero Kogas, using the dogs made by the creator Kagan. North Sutu references to Europeans as dogs in the aftermath of the 1898 Malabok War against the South African Republic were no more complimentary. And finally, we still need to pin down precisely when dogs arrived in southern Africa and how they then spread within it. I've speculated before about the possibility of an introduction of dogs in association with the arrival of sheep and perhaps cattle herding pastoralists some 2,000 years ago, and suggested that careful re-examination of bones for traces of dog-induced damage in faunal assemblages rich in sheep, like those from Boomplaas near Oudtshoorn or Gedalt in Namibia, might be worthwhile. Yet while that sheep-dog association is tempting, we still have no definite first millennium dog remains at any herder site, except at Kasteelberg near Saldanha. And even there, confirmation of identification and direct dating are desirable. Nor, it should be said, around 2,000 years ago, do we yet have any evidence of dogs in East Africa, the area from which ancestral Kwe-speaking herders moved south. For now then, more plausibly perhaps, dogs probably only did arrive in southern Africa with iron-using farmers, and as I noted earlier, this does not seem to be evident before about the 8th century. This was also when other exotic items like chickens, rats, glass beads, and even rare sherds of Middle Eastern pottery first trickle into the archaeological record of KwaZulu-Natal. That coincidence, that association, is tantalizing, but it still leaves totally open the question of how and when dogs would then have spread inland between agro-pastoralist groups, or how they might have moved from farmers to herders and farmers to hunter-gatherers, and then onward among herders and hunter-gatherers themselves. Direct dating, combined with detailed osteoarchaeological studies and biomolecular analyses, plus of course more specimens acquired by excavating new sites or revisiting old collections, will eventually clarify this, I'm sure, as it has already done with determining when chickens and black rats were introduced to the east coast of Africa, or dogs and other domestic animals to the island of Madagascar. As this is done, and as systematic multidisciplinary research expands, our understanding of the connections between dogs and people in southern Africa can only grow. Thank you very much indeed.